Third part of Kamikaze now, looking at the final three stanzas. We've looked at how initially in the first stanza the kamikaze pilot is determined to do his duty, or has a duty to do. But in that first stanza, a couple of hints that perhaps he's in two minds. The next three stanzas are full of contradictions between both the patriotic and the family and nature. The final three stanzas really encapsulate the tragic decision that he's made. The irony of the ending is really quite heartbreaking and one of the most powerful endings of any of the poems in the collection. To bring their father's boat safe, yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too. They treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. So let's start with a little bit of punctuation, a little bit of a structural point. Notice I've highlighted the dashes in red. Now, dashes as a piece of punctuation, great message for you writing this. Dashes highlight important ideas. They make them stand out from the rest of a passage. And this is no different. Yes, grandfather's boat. The yes, she's talking to someone, presumably the daughter of the kamikaze pilot is talking to her children. And we've now got a sense of regret for how she treated her father when he came back and chose to live, because he's referred to as grandfather. A sense of relationship, a sense of love through that relationship between her and him, and between her children and him. Yes, grandfather's boat, as if the yes there, as if she's been questioned as to whether this man really was a relation to them. Yes, grandfather's boat, that sense of regret that, yeah, he is our grandfather. We should acknowledge his existence, his relationship to us, possibly some sense of pride at not doing his duty, at choosing to live, perhaps. But only much later did that regret come about. Safe to the shore. So this is the return of the kamikaze pilot, having chosen to land back home safe. But we also link back to the childhood of the kamikaze pilot with the hordes of fish that have been brought in by the fishing boats. Salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns. So all of the different fish that were brought back. But we'll focus on the last two, which I think are particularly interesting. The loose silver of whitebait. In part two, we looked at silver, the flashing silver, being reminiscent and symbolic of the samurai sword flashing of the warrior Japanese. And here, the loose silver. Words together are called collocations, and images are created by poets with particularly interesting choice of words, by particularly interesting collocations. Loose silver. Now, for me, I would read in this particular image, the loose silver, the fact that no longer does silver represent glory and the warrior and the fighting spirit and the patriotism. The loose silver now seems to have lost its shine, seems to have lost its glory, perhaps. It hints at the shame that he's brought back. And once a tuna. I don't know whether you've ever seen a full tuna. They're absolutely massive. You know, we're used to them in cans, aren't we, or small steaks or whatever. But a tuna as a fish is enormous. A tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. Now, remember, fishes are a symbol of life in the poem. and fishes are also a symbol of childhood. And in this sense, it's the first image of fish being slightly dangerous, of being some sort of bringer of ominous fortune. The dark prince. So the fish that have brought him back safe, as in his memory of the fish, have actually brought danger, have brought shame. The tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. All of that hints at shame, at darkness, at anger, and that's actually what he brought back. He didn't bring back life, he brought back shame upon his family. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence. Just pause to think about that for a minute. My mother never spoke in his presence. Not only did he not get spoken to by his wife, she never even acknowledged his existence by talking to anyone else while he was there. It's desperately sad. It's desperately disappointing. It's a complete contrast to what he expected to come back to, having made that decision to live. Nor did she meet his eyes, and the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. So the whole village feels that this is a man who'd gone out to bring them glory and has only succeeded in bringing on shame. That expectation to die for your country has been rejected, and this reflects so badly upon the whole community. So nobody even speaks to him. Nobody admits that he exists any longer. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent. There's lots of images of childhood here, isn't it? Both the Kamikaze pilot's own childhood, but here too, the relation of the Kamikaze pilot, who reflects back on how she treated the father that came back, and it's the innocence of children again, in that they still chatted to father because they didn't understand what he was supposed to go out and do. They didn't understand that he brought back shame, and it was only learnt behaviour to ignore him. So the tragedy of this is that the children acknowledged their father's return until they noticed how everybody else was behaving towards him, and they learned to be silent. So they learned to shun him. So not only did the Kamikaze come back to find that all of the adults around him would ignore him, he was spoken to initially by the children, but that got worse. His communication with the children declined until it was nothing, till those children had learned to ignore him too. So this sadness, this prolonged ignoring of him lasts and gets worse as time goes on, until gradually we too learn to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. Notice that loved is in the past tense. There's no love for him now. There's no respect. There's no acknowledgement of his existence. It's deeply tragic. The tone of this poem is so sad towards the end. And we're going to come and talk about the irony of this final ending. Endings are so crucial in poems. As I've mentioned before, the ending of a poem is the last image, the last thought, the last tone that the poet wants us to take. So our reflection upon this poem is guided by its final images. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. So he had two choices to die. He had the choice to die instantly in glory. That was the path that he shunned. That was the path that he rejected. He didn't want to die in such horrific circumstances. He was supposed to die in glory. He didn't feel that that was at all glorious, and so chose to come back to his family. And yet his death was prolonged. His death lasted however many years from his return to his eventual death, presumably from old age. And in all of that time, he brought shame, he brought rejection, he brought silence. And so it's desperately ironic, desperately tragic that he died to be with his family, but actually his life only made them ignore him, to be ashamed of him, to reject him. And so the very decision, the very reason that he chose to live brought about a long, prolonged, awful, lonely existence. So we've got the desperately sad ending of this poem. Let's start to think about links. It's a poem about identity. His identity as a family man, but his identity as a kamikaze pilot, one who should have died in glory, according to the Japanese patriotism. So it's a contrast of identities, and in that it goes quite well with something like Checking Out My History, or Tissue, or Emigre, that internal conflict of what identity actually means. But it's also a poem about reflections on war, reflections on personal responses to war. So it might go well there with War Photographer, Remains, Bayonet Charge, Exposure. If you wanted to learn this poem as one of your key poems to go with others, it could link to something like Charge of the Light Brigade. If you've got a question about warfare itself and different presentations of warfare, because there's enough in this poem that suggests that war for him should have been glorious in that patriotic view of the Japanese that links so well with the nobility and honour that the Light Brigade was supposed to be remembered in, according to Alfred Lord Tennyson. But you've got some interesting elements of contrast as well. And when you're writing your essay in the exam, if you can get a mixture between similarities and difference, between connections and contrasts in your answers, then that only shows the examiner that you're really thinking, that you've got a number of different ways that you can link and contrast the poems. So it's, again, a really good one to learn. Lots of very good key quotes, lots of easy language terminology, subject-specific language that you can use in there, the similes, the lexical field of glory, the irony of the ending. So there's plenty in there with metaphorical language too, plenty that you can sort of grab and squeeze as much out of as you possibly can.